So what is codependency? Codependency is an emotional and behavioral condition where an individual excessively cares for someone else's needs at the expense of their own.
Have you ever had a time where you're completely focused on your loved one and their behavior, whether they're waking up hungover or you feel like they've had a drink or they're having really negative behavior and you start walking on eggshells? That is codependency, when you're taking someone else's temperature to take your own. Mm-hmm. And we'll go into how that happens in a little bit. But
I think I want to just add that codependency is such a common phrase. Like, oh, she's codependent or they're coda. I think in our culture, it has been loosely thrown around. And so we want to go deeper into what it actually looks like when it's problematic and how it affects us, and then how we identify that and shift our behaviors so we're able to get relief and we're able to put ourselves first, not feel resentful, not walk on eggshells, not live in fear, and be able to move forward.
Yeah, and it also gets a little tricky too, because when we have loved ones, whether it's a partner or spouse or a child or an adult child or a parent, it's like what might in definition terms feel like codependency, on the other hand, might feel like loving someone and caring about them. Mm-hmm. So how do you tease that out and distinguish between healthy codependency and unhealthy codependency?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it's so important to identify that codependency and the unhealthy codependency doesn't mean you have to stop loving someone.
Yeah.
It's very different. It's when it's at the expense of yourself and you're not taking care of yourself in addition to loving that person.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it does begin with us. And we have to find that place in ourselves where we feel like we're comfortable in our own skin. And if there's things going on, it doesn't mean that we're super happy or not challenged, but that we feel like we're moving through our day in a way that feels grounded, and we're handling things. And that's where we all want to get to, I think, is healthy relationships, and just in a place where we don't feel like we're walking on eggshells because of someone else's behavior.
Yeah, so I think the first place to start would be with, why does it happen?
Yeah.
So we will touch on attachment later on as we get further into this, because it's a really important piece of codependency and where it comes from. To start, if you grow up in a dysfunctional family system, you often learn to rely on your external environment for validation. And so when that happens, you also learn to try and control the outcome of things. So you get a certain result that gives you that validation. And with that, it slowly creeps into a habitual dynamic where you are trying to control someone else's behavior to feel okay and feel a sense of homeostasis, or even a sense of validation and happiness.
Yeah, so when we're in codependent behaviors, we move into a cycle of fear avoidance and manipulation. And just to give you an example of that, with my late ex-husband, if we were going to go to a party and I was already fearful that he was going to drink too much, I would avoid doing certain things to not upset him. And I would manipulate certain things throughout the evening to try to feel like I had this control, which was a complete false sense of control around his drinking, to avoid embarrassment, shame, and similar kinds of dynamics happened when I was thinking that Lyle was having a problem with drugs. And it was an awful place for me to be. It felt really amped up my anxiety. Then I got depressed, feeling like, is this ever going to change? And so that that is what codependency is and how we experience it.
Yeah, and I'll speak to this in a little, of going through the same thing with my dad, and even as a kid trying to accommodate his moods, and it gave me a false sense of control. And then you get trapped in the loop of wanting to control your environment and wanting that validation. I think the challenge here is the results of what happens when you are in a codependent dynamic, and that is that you're often left feeling really burnt out, resentful, fearful. You're engaging in avoidant behavior, and we'll get into specifics of what all of that looks like. But really what happens is you are sacrificing yourself to try and manipulate an outcome, and it puts you in this role of having a false sense of control. So it feels like, oh, well, this is all working, and sometimes I get the results I want, so I'm going to keep going in this role I'm in. The challenge is that it's not really that sustainable. I certainly at a point felt like I was losing my mind because I was so burnt out. I was exhausted trying to do what I thought would appease my dad and make him act a certain way, when in reality I was 100% powerless, and he was going to do what he was going to do despite me trying to be the perfect child or keep the house clean or things like that. Do you want to speak to any more of your experiences with being burnt out?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest culprit was my resentment. I just felt almost like I was in this martyr role where I would put myself on the back burner and take care of so many things, whether it was for Lyle or it was for Michael. And I just was really angry and resentful that life was becoming hard and that they weren't holding up their own so that everything could get back to normal. And so resentment's a big one for me, and I think for everyone who is in this kind of a situation.
Yeah, and I love how you said that, of feeling like a martyr, because it's so true, where you can't control their behavior, you're not responsible for it, and you are engaging in the self-destructive behavior, in putting yourself on the back burner. It feels like you need to, and for a long time, it usually serves us. It definitely served me for a while until I was so burnt out and resentful that I couldn't do it anymore. And I think the beauty is that you do have a choice. Once you've realized, oh, okay, I'm in this codependent dynamic, I'm engaging in this behavior, there's room for growth here. You get to shift your ways. You don't have to be stuck in it. It's not easy. It's a process, and there are certainly growing pains, and you're not trapped.
But I just want to speak to one thing, because where I felt trapped was that the only option with Daddy is for me to leave the marriage. And then my kids are going to grow up in a broken home, and he's a juvenile diabetic, so type 1 diabetic, so he's going to die if I'm not there to find him when he's low on blood sugars. And these are like practical things that I was thinking about. And then with you, I thought, well, she's such a beautiful girl, I can't have her out homeless on the streets of LA. So my mind went to, here are my options. And I don't like any of the options, but certainly I can't allow my loved ones to die. And so I did feel very trapped, and I love what you said about having options, because we don't have to fix it. We don't have to fix it all at once. It's more about taking the insight that we get from the education and making small shifts of self-care. And we evolve organically. And as we start to shift, the system that we're in starts to shift. And that's how we start to have emotional growth in codependent relationships.
Yeah, that's such a good point because it is so true. You're not trapped and you may feel very trapped, as you said. And I wonder for you, how did you get to a place where you were able to relinquish that fear?
We're going to get to that as we go through the modules and we start to give you more insight into these behaviors around family addiction. You will see in your own relationships that may feel very toxic how you can start to put the focus on yourself.
Definitely. And the last thing I want to add here is just that, yes, we're talking about family addictions. And so I think naturally what can come to mind is codependency behaviors with the addict or the alcoholic, the person who is struggling with substance use. And it's not always the case. So, for example, my dad was the identified alcoholic in our home while I was growing up, and codependency didn't stop with him. I felt very codependent with my mom as well. And so, you know, if she didn't feel okay one day or she was visibly upset, understandably, surrounding my dad's behaviors or his drinking, I took that on and I didn't feel okay. Or I wanted her to be happy, so I would try and clean the house, things that I did with my dad, similar. And I tried to do that with her as well. So I think it's just really important to point out that it doesn't just have to be with the individual struggling with drugs and alcohol.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, if we have codependency with one person in our life, we're having those same behaviors, whether we're checking out at a market or we're talking to a bank teller or we're our employer, whatever it is. Like, the codependency is an inside behavioral cycle that we get into in every facet of our life. And it also is intergenerational. Mm-hmm. So my codependency started for me in growing up in a dysfunctional family, and then that carried through to the way I parented Lyle, the way I was in my marriage. And it wasn't until I started learning about codependency and the shifts that I could start to make for myself that I realized, you know, I feel much better. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole lot of other stuff that we'll get to also that comes along with making these shifts, the kind of the backlash of guilty feelings or shame or just all of these great things. And I say great because it's grist for the mill. We get to start to understand what our dynamic is, how to work with it, and also how to shift it and start to be gentler with ourselves. And then once we start to connect the dots about our own lineage in this journey, we get to really see that we've come by it honestly. And it's a really good opportunity for emotional sobriety.
Yeah, and have compassion for ourselves. Yeah. And not just feel like, what's wrong with you? Why are you acting this way? Because it comes naturally. It's sometimes handed down to us. It's a fear response.
Yeah.
And it's important to love ourselves through the growing out of it. So, okay.